My uncle was the sheriff of a small town in New Mexico. He was the most hardcore person in our family, super straight-laced, never really BS'd, and wasn't at all a joker in any way. So when he told his story, which was backed up by my aunt, we all believed it without question. A local reporter named Bob D. would always show up at any major police activity from the police scanner. Big car wrecks, fires, anything worth maybe reporting in the local paper. Everybody on the force knew Bob. He was around at least once or twice a week at various police activities. Bob was a bit of a joker himself. He would mess with people by flicking behind their ears. People would react to flicks thinking it was a bug, only to turn around and see it was Bob jerking around. Everybody liked Bob, though. Unfortunately, Bob had bad lung cancer and died pretty suddenly. His wife buried him against his wishes. He wanted to be cremated. For the next couple of weeks after his funeral, people kept talking about seeing Bob at a car wreck, fires, all the same stuff he used to report on. There were 20 to 30 reports like this from civilians and members of the force alike. My uncle didn't buy it though, until the night he and my aunt showed up at our house, gun drawn, pale as a paper. We asked him what the hell had happened, and he had to sit down, take his breath, compose himself, and start to outline what had happened. This is a guy that I never saw get rattled by anything. He said, my aunt and him were sitting on the couch in their house watching TV. My uncle kept scratching at his ear over and over. Finally, my aunt asked him what was the problem, and he turned around just in time to see their bedroom door open. Bob D. was there standing in the doorway, clear as day. My uncle jumped up, cussed or something, got my aunt's attention, who turned to see him there too. As soon as they both made eye contact with him, Bob just smiled, turned, walked across the living room and out their front door, closed the door behind himself and was gone. My uncle got control of himself and ran outside, gun drawn looking for Bob, but he was gone. At that point, they ran over to our place. We went over there and didn't see anything, but my aunt and uncle stayed at our place that night. At work the next day, all the guys on the force were giving my uncle lots of "we told you so." People around town said they saw Bob show up at police scenes for at least another 2 to 3 months. My dad saw him in our dark room in our basement with a friend. He was flicking their ears in the dark. During the 3rd month, people that saw him kept saying he was looking worse and worse. My uncle saw him 2 more times, each time confirming he was looking more and more worn out. My dad had concluded that he was decomposing and his ghost was reflecting that process. Every time my ear itches, I get goosebumps now. Whilst working in a remote area in Australia, we were forced to move on an elderly Aboriginal man because the other locals had accused him of witchcraft and other things. We drove him to his township, approximately 1.5 hours drive away. The other locals were terrified of him, as he was rumored to be a witch doctor. We dropped him off and warned him not to return to town for 3 days. We turned the vehicle around and drove it back to town, flying probably 100 or so miles an hour. It took 45 minutes to drive back, roughly. Upon our return, we find this same elderly Aboriginal sitting in the street. To this day, neither of us can explain it, and maybe the other locals had every right to be scared. I worked as a police officer in a small town in rural Nebraska. Back in the 90s, I was patrolling through town in winter. We had several abandoned houses in town, but one seemed to have the attraction of copper thieves, so we were told to keep an eye on it. Drove by it around 7 p.m. since it sat on a corner lot. I had a clear view of all 4 sides of the house. As I drove around the corner, nothing looks out of the ordinary. About 2 hours later, I drive by again and the back door is wide open. I know that the back door was not opened by when I drove by earlier. Looking at the snow on the ground around the house, there were no footprints. So I think, what the hell? Call dispatch, tell them I'm investigating an open door at the address, and ask for a county sheriff to start my way. I walk to the open door, pull out my flashlight, and shine it inside. The house has obviously been gutted for the most part. The plaster walls have been torn down, debris piles everywhere. Since there were no footprints in the snow around the door other than mine, and with all the dust on the floor not showing any footprints, I chalk it up to the wind, or maybe the door just opened up on its own. I was about to secure the door when I heard a loud thump come from upstairs, and what sounded like kids laughing. So I enter the house and yell out, "Police department, come downstairs!" More of what sounds like kids playing. I tell the dispatch that it sounds like there are kids in the house, and start making my way through the kitchen into the living room where the stairs are, all the while cautiously checking the main floor. 2 more times I hear something upstairs, but since I've had no response, I start thinking maybe it's an animal. Still, I hear what I'd swear was kids laughing. I head upstairs and it all gets quiet. The upstairs is relatively small, with a hallway at the top of the stairs that has 1 bedroom on the right, 1 straight ahead at the end of the hall, and a bedroom on the left. As I get to the top of the stairs, I hear a thump in the bedroom to the left. I carefully peek around the door, and it's an empty room with a small pile of plaster and wood debris in the middle. No kidding. Sitting on top of the pile of debris was a page torn out of a child's book with a picture of a police officer on it. The hair stood up on the back of my neck so quickly. I got out of that room quickly and cleared the other rooms upstairs and got the hell out of there. I told dispatch nobody was in the house, locked the back door, and never went back in there again. My uncle works for dispatch in my town, and he recently told my family of the weirdest call he's ever gotten. He says that he had received a call from a landline one night, and when he answered it, there was only static on the other end. This happened 2 more times. Finally, he calls a squad to go check out the address from the caller ID. When the cops got there and walked into the house, they immediately saw that there was a dead body. The person had been dead for 5 months. The craziest part about it was that there was no electricity or any other utility working, so there is no way they should have been able to get those calls into dispatch. But if they hadn't, who knows how long that person's body would have stayed there. I was doing security at a hospital with an ER, ICU, surgical, the whole works, and I got called to several paranormal calls. Most were psych cases or paranoid people that heard a strange noise. This time, more than one nurse saw a guy on the camera who was on his death's bed. A guy who kept saying, "I will not die in a hospital," earlier that day. Literally push his curtain aside and walk out of his room toward the elevator. A code was called and everybody immediately posted at their designated locations. Within seconds, there were people watching the elevators and stairs, and security started combing the area and investigating. As I reached the ICU floor, I spoke with the lead nurse, and she told me several of the nurses saw him leave. At that moment, monitors started going off. The guy never left. The guy went code blue and died right then. There were 3 witnesses on the report that say he got up and left and were serious enough to call a code, which could cost them their jobs if they were wrong. The bosses wouldn't let us watch the video, but the looks on their faces said it all. The bosses said that the nurses did the right thing, and some things just can't be explained. The portion of the video I was allowed to see did show that nobody had left via elevator or stairs. My dad spent his whole career as a copper and is the stereotypical straightforward bloke with it who has little time for anything you might label as paranormal. That said, he describes one event from about 20 years ago that he just can't explain. One late afternoon in autumn, he was patrolling with a colleague in Newbury, which is in Berkshire, UK, when they were radioed and asked to check out reports of a fight on a rural outskirts of town. Apparently, sounds of an altercation had been heard coming from a field, of all places, and locals were concerned. When they got to the field in question, my dad and his colleague hopped the fence and headed inwards, not immediately seeing or hearing anything. It was gloomy and a little misty at the ground level, but apparently just about enough light was left in the day to see there wasn't obviously anyone about. Apparently, they gave the field a sweep and were on their way back to the car when, as my dad describes it, suddenly all went mental. Shouting, screaming, and the sounds of an almighty fight completely surrounded him, even though he had stood in a field completely empty apart from his colleague. He says 3 things in particular stick with him. Firstly, that he wasn't scared shitless at the time. Perhaps he would say that. Just sort of hugely confused. And secondly, the look on his colleague's face that basically said, "What the hell? You're hearing this too, right?" And finally, that after a short time, the sounds just stopped, and they made their way back to the car and called in to say nothing was going on. When pushed, he admits it felt like he was in the middle of something significant, and that he thinks he felt, not just heard, the fighting around him. And with hindsight, he is more frightened after the event than at the time. He would never describe this as paranormal himself, but to me this always sounded like a replay type of event people talk about. And subsequently learning about the Civil War history at the specific area in question backs this up. Well, for me at least. I've not heard other accounts of similar stories from the area, but I haven't looked that hard, to be honest. And I'm not sure if I want to. Called to a residence out in the boonies. This was in Wyoming, so the boonies are really the boonies. This was at about 11 p.m. and for suspicious activity specifically. When we get there, we are told by the family living there that there are some very strange screams coming from a creek roughly about 1,000 feet out. And sure enough, waiting outside on the porch with them for about a minute, I hear it. It is a very, very strange sound. It's hard to describe what it sounded like. It was like a woman in very severe distress, but higher pitched, and each scream lasted for about 10 to 15 seconds. It never sounded like it was saying anything. It just sounded like a cry of sheer terror, and it repeated again and again. We tell the family we're going to go investigate, so we just walk down to the creek since it was nice out. We hear about 2 more screams getting louder as we approach the creek. By now, we're both kind of freaked out. There are 2 possibilities at this point. Someone is getting murdered, maimed in the creek bed, or it's a wild animal. As we approach the creek bed, we hear no screams for about 5 minutes. We search around and find nothing, yelling at the top of our lungs for somebody to come towards if they're there. Then we hear the exact same scream behind us, exactly from where we came from. We get about halfway back to the house and the scream comes so loudly, it seems to be right next to us. We frantically shine our flashlights everywhere and find nothing. No eye glints of animals, no rustling of bushes, just silence. We trace our steps back and the screams come from around the creek again. This time, it lasted about 30 seconds and was much louder than before. Our retreat becomes a little more hastened. By this time, we were both scared shitless and verified with the family to call us again if they heard it. They never called again, and we got the hell out of there. I still don't know what it is. As an avid outdoorsman, I know no animal makes a cry like that, especially one that moves stealthily without being spotted by flashlights. Something else that weirded me out was that it was completely silent while the screams were happening. During summer in Wyoming, there was always some type of ambient animal sounds. Frogs croaking, crickets chirping, owls hooting, coyotes howling, etc. You get the picture. But there was nothing. Until we were leaving and the screams had stopped, then a frog had started croaking again. It gives me the creeps just thinking about it still. But from being a hunter, I don't know if any of you know this, but when the woods go silent, that usually means there's a large predator in the area. And in this case, I don't want to find out what that predator was that night. Back when I was working as a cop on a military base, I loved working night shift. Didn't deal with it 99% of the bullshit that the day shift dealt with, and what little stuff we did deal with was usually really interesting. Well, most every building on a base is alarmed, and the alarms are tied right into the desks, so we know the instant they go off. When we get an alarm activation, we close the base and go check the building, pull on all the doors, see if we can get in. If we can, we go into the building and secure it, check all the doors and corners to see if someone set the alarm off. Well, one night I was on patrol with my alpha, and we get called to respond to an alarm activation at the elementary school. So we go, secure the building, and call in that the building is all secure. No problem, just keep patrolling. So about 15 to 20 minutes go by, and we get another alarm activation. We get back out there and check, and now there is a maintenance door open that leads into a boiler roomish thing. Nothing in it though. We close it, lock it, and get out. Another 20 minutes, and another alarm. We respond. All the doors are still locked, and we can't get in. The maintenance door is even locked. Call in and all clear. This time, my buddy and I sit on opposite sides of the school and watch to see if someone is coming and yanking the doors real hard to set the alarm off. We sit there and watch. Nothing happens, and right as we're about to leave, another alarm activation as we're sitting there. We inform the desk that we'd like the building manager on site to help us secure the interior and to let us in. At the time, this is about 3 a.m. roughly. Building custodian shows up and we start doing a walkthrough, checking all the classrooms and checking all of the maintenance rooms. And that's when we see one of the maintenance doors open with the lights on in the room. Now this room is literally the size of a closet. I kid you not. We walk down there and look in. No one's in it, and the door is locked when it closes. We look in there and we find a single footprint of a bare foot made of water, left foot as I recall, of a small child. Freaked the living hell out of us because no one reported a missing child and the entire building was clear and still locked up. No one left, no one entered, and we checked every inch of that damn place. Literally a 3-hour deep sweep including ceiling tiles. Freaked the ever-loving shit out of us, and to this day, my partner refuses to go into that school. Speaking of which, schools are really spooky when they're empty. I was called to a home of an elderly woman, mid-60s to be exact. She reported that there were ghosts in her attic or basement every night for the past week or so. So I go in and I don't hear anything. I check the basement and the attic as she shows me around. I shine my light in the attic, but I don't see anything. The basement had lights on, but still nothing to be seen. A week goes by and I get called back to her home again, but this time I'm working a night shift. I go and check the basement. Nothing. I check the attic and there is a man with torn clothes huddled in a corner. Apparently, he was climbing in her window on cold nights. Not my call, but my dad served for 25 years. Wasn't really a ghost story, but I think it's worth telling. One night, he gets a call from a woman who says her neighbor has made a pact with the devil. The woman calling is about 35 and a religious wacko. The neighbor who called is about 75 at the time. My dad went over and knocked on the door, and the old lady answers, all happy. Nice place, decorated the same way for the past 50 years. She invites my dad in without even asking why he came, makes him some coffee, and asks how his day was. Naturally, at this point, my dad is wondering what the hell the call was about, but it came clear soon. At some point, my dad realizes he isn't the only person she is talking to, and that she thinks her apartment is full of people. My dad thanks her for the coffee, and she tells him to come back anytime. The whole time she was talking, he was writing down the names of the people she was talking to, and does some research on her when he gets back. Turns out she was talking to family members, who were all dead. She had a daughter, 3 sons, a brother, and a husband, all dead, and she had no family and no friends. She hadn't spoken to another person in years. Her groceries were delivered, and she rarely left her apartment. Over the next 19 years, my dad took care of her. My sister and I came over all the time and just sat and talked with her. She even taught me how to cook. Over the years, she stabilized and stopped talking to her dead relatives. She just needed people to live with. She actually lived till she was roughly 94 and died in the guest room of my parents' house since it had become harder to take care of her from a distance as she got closer to the end. She was like a grandma for us, but that's that. Not me, but my dad was a cop for 32 years, and this was one of his craziest calls. A call goes out for reported screaming. It's mid-January, which is important for later. My father and another officer respond to find a known deranged individual with a very long rap sheet and has been in and out of psychiatric care for years, sitting on the front porch holding a double-sided wood splitting axe. Steam is coming up off the grass, and there are chunks lying all over the lawn. Upon interviewing the suspect, he admits that he and a friend were playing poker. The suspect was losing nearly every hand and came to the conclusion that his friend was a haint, which is Southern for ghost, and was cheating him. The suspect grabbed the axe and chased his friend outside and hacked him into dozens of pieces, thus causing the warm blood to create steam on the grass. My dad tells the suspect that he needs to get in the police car because it ain't proof. He said that the suspect dropped the axe and sprinted to get in the back seat while thanking them for helping him. "3 years ago, our very elderly next-door neighbor died suddenly in her house. They found her body 5 days later in the kitchen. Fast forward to last summer. I'm sitting in my house watching a movie, and all of a sudden, there were about 8 police cars come out of nowhere, sirens blaring, lights on, and most park in that empty house. Some park in my driveway, so I went outside to see what was up. A police officer went through the quick formalities and asked if I had seen anything strange in the past 5 minutes. I replied no, and rather hesitantly asked what was going on. He said that the police department received a call from the house, and when the operator picked up the line went dead. I stayed at a friend's that night." I was a 911 dispatcher for about 5 years out of school. One night, I got a call from a lady at a residence in town. "911, what's your emergency?" "Is this the police?" she breathed. She was freaking out. Heavy breathing, scared, shaking voice. I've taken many calls like this, and from the sound of her voice, this was not going to be a routine call. I sat up straight and my heart started to pump faster. "Yes, ma'am, what is your emergency?" "There's someone in my house." She trailed off, very breathy and genuine, but not loud and freaking out. "Okay, are you located at house address?" "Yes." I dispatched the cars to start heading over to the address, and I don't give a reason yet. "Okay, do you know who this person is?" "Well, no, I don't. I think it's... I know this sounds crazy. I think that there's a ghost in my house." She begins to sob and sound so scared. "There's noises, and I know there is a ghost right in the other room. I could hear it right now." At this time, the sergeant asked me the reason of the call and why I sent him and 2 other cars without explanation. "Normally, you send 1 car to something like that. It's suspicious activity," I told him. "What activity?" he demanded over the radio. A fair question. "Sir, the caller is claiming there is someone in the house and she believes it to be a ghost." Silence on the air for about a minute. 10-4 is all he said. By the time they got there, the ghost was gone and the poor lady was a freaked out mess. And she kept apologizing for calling us. "But it was real," she kept repeating. The officers later told me that her sincerity actually freaked them out a lot. And when they searched the house, guns drawn, even they were scared of the presence they felt. Police officer here. One evening, about 8 years ago, it was pouring outside, and we got a call from an elderly woman. Seems to be a common theme in this whole turn of events. She called in and said that she was hearing footsteps in her house, and she thought there was a ghost inside because she regularly heard the sound of someone walking upstairs, but she lived alone. We went just to check it outside and make sure everything was okay. She stayed on the line with the 911 operator because she was frightened. About 3 minutes after she initially called in, she said that there was actually a man standing outside in her backyard, staring at her through her sliding glass door. Petrified, the woman froze in that spot and continued to stare directly at the man. For the next minute or two, she said he was just standing there, still as could be, staring at her. Eventually, the man slunk off out of sight. When we arrived, about 12 minutes after the call first came in, we went to the front door. I remained in the foyer with the woman, and the other officer went to the backyard to see if the man was still hiding out or if there were any traces of him. I spoke with her for several minutes until the other officer returned. He said there was no trace of anyone having been in the backyard. We set off to do a quick sweep before we left to make sure the house was all clear. In her living room, the room that has the sliding glass door, we discovered a trail of mud and footprints inside the house. I asked the woman if she had been outside at all that day or if anyone had been over to visit her. She said no, that she lived alone, and that no one had come by to visit. The woman was very old, probably around 85 or so, and had very poor eyesight and was hard of hearing, as elderly people tend to be. The woman obviously had seen the man's reflection and mistakenly thought he was in front of her, on the other side of the glass in her backyard. In reality, he had been standing only a few feet behind her in the same room while she had been talking to 911. Nothing was stolen, broken, or out of place, so we don't know what his intentions were. Who knows what would have happened had she not stayed on the line with the operator. I know it sounds like something out of a campfire story, but it was honestly one of the most unnerving and creepy experiences I've ever had while on duty. I'm a security patrol officer from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. roughly in Scottsdale, Arizona. I have the largest security beat in the Scottsdale desert, and part of my job is to respond to alarm calls in these isolated mansions throughout Scottsdale, Cave Creek, and Carefree. One night, I got an alarm call at a small airport where the rich play with their airplanes. Sky Ranch Airport, to be exact. Part of the airport are residential homes with built-in hangars, and that's where the alarm was tripped at 2:30 a.m. On arrival, I went through the normal alarm process, called dispatch to make a call to the homeowners, which is vacant, so no one should be there. After the call is made, I knock on the front door very aggressively, just to make sure if someone is home, they'll hear me before I make an entry. I've walked in on the homeowners before at a different house. Anyway, as I walked toward the front door, I heard a little shuffling noise behind the door. Very faint, but loud enough to be noticed. That being the case, I rang the doorbell and knocked on the door longer than the usual, and nothing. So I then began the perimeter check, and I found the back sliding door handle was broken. But there was a little note on the inside that read, "Handle is broken, realtor." The realtor placed a metal rod down to keep the sliding door from opening. I finished the perimeter check, called the dispatch to let them know that I was going to make entry. The house was beautiful and everything was fine, so I wrote out my entry slip and was resetting the alarm. But a fault showed on the display that read, Zone 35 backroom door. And at that very moment, my supervisor called me via radio and asked if I knew anything about the house I was in. What he told me more than anything annoyed the shit out of me. He said back in 2008, the previous homeowner committed suicide by the front door with a shotgun when the economy crashed, leaving behind a wife and 3 kids. I knew he was trying to scare me, so I brushed it off and resumed my business. I walked to the back sliding door, and lo and behold, the metal rod was removed, and the sliding door was open about 4 inches. That alone was creepy. The house has motion sensors, including sensors on the door itself, and none of them were showing up as fault. I put the road back into its original place and armed the system. A few months later, I had an alarm call at a different house, and this time Scottsdale police assisted me. After the call was over and done with it, we stood outside the home bullshitting, and I asked the police if they knew about that house in Sky Ranch Airport. One of the officers said he was one of the first police officers on the scene shortly after the homeowner blew his brains out by the front door. They confirmed the suicide, and if I've ever to respond to that house again, I'll make sure to ask for backup.